So hello everybody, we're here with Eugene Scheel, who is a map maker. You're currently with Loudoun County. You're somewhat of a local celebrity, sir. I knew about your work before I even researched you independently. Um, I have one of your maps on my wall, the Fauquier County map of 1776. I'm looking at it right now. So I heard a lot about you without even taking this job. So I take that to be a good sign. Everybody seems to know who you are in the locality. And so I want to welcome you and everybody watching. We've got quite a treat here. So how did you get started as a map maker? What specifically drew you to map making as opposed to other historical work?
I grew up during World War II, and maps were on the front pages of all the newspapers showing the progress of the Allied forces. And so I started to doodle maps, imaginary countries and imaginary islands, and I drew bird's eye views of towns and cities and seaports. And so I've been at it since I was about 7 or 8 years old.
Wow, that's quite early to know. It's quite early to realize that you want to do something with the rest of your life. Did you know at that age that you wanted to get into specifically map making?
No, I did not. I didn't really think about it as a profession until I was a senior at high school. I went to New Rochelle High School in New Rochelle, New York, in Westchester County. And I was uncertain about which college I might go to pursue map making. So I wrote Gilbert Grosvenor, the founder and editor of the National Geographic magazine, and asked him what college he would recommend going to. And he said he would recommend Clark University, a small liberal arts school in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so that's where I went to college.
Great. So what drove you to move to Virginia? Was it UVA?
Well, again, many years, not about 6 years later, I had finished my military service in the United States Marine Corps, and I had graduated from Clark with pretty high honors. And so I wrote Dr. Grosvenor again at the National Geographic magazine. And I told him of my brief experiences and that now I would like to work for the National Geographic magazine. So he said, well, wonderful. He said, come down from an interview. And so I came down, worked for the National Geographic for 9 years, and that's how I got to this area.
Mhm. So in your career, did you focus mainly on Northern Virginia, or did you also cover some of the areas you've lived in previously?
I began with a focus definitely on Northern Virginia, specifically Loudoun County. After I left the National Geographic, I decided I wanted to go on my own. And the realtors in Loudoun County wanted a detailed map of the county because at the time there were only route numbers on all the roads. It was mostly a rural county then, 1971. And people wanted to use the road names. In other words, all the old timers knew the road names, but they did not know the route numbers because they had been changed 2 and 3 times since 1932. And so I started putting on the road names and getting them from old timers. And I started to realize that old timers were interested in more just the names. They wanted to tell me how these names came about and about some of the important features along the roads. So the 1972 map of Loudoun County became a historical map.
Great, great. And I guess if somebody came to you and said they want to do what you do, they want to make maps, what would you tell them? What kind of training do you think they'd need to acquire? Because clearly you weren't, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't take official classes, a degree or anything of the like for map making specifically.
Well, the way I make maps is probably the way people made maps 50 to 100 years ago. I'm one of the few persons that still makes them. I draw them by hand. Uh, my maps are drawn in ink or colored pencil. All my writing is freehand. And so it's a real sort of specialized type of profession, which few people are involved in today.
Okay. So what kind of sources do you say that you reference for these maps? I assume you're working with a lot of original historical maps.
My main sources, other than books and plats and surveys and typical research sources, are people who have been in the county a long time in a certain area. And I drive around with them in my pickup truck, and we go from road to road and stop at whenever we get to, say, a historic house or a graveyard or someplace, and we talk about it, and I jot it down on some other maps that I have. And so I would say my sources are quite varied, but for a lot of the historical information, you have to rely on people who were there and who actually experienced the area well before I came about.
Mhm. Do you ever encounter conflicting information with your sources? Uh, Certain sources that might say a road was built in a certain year, or others that might say it was built in another year, and how do you distill the truth out of multiple sources that might contradict each other?
How do I distill the truth out of multiple sources? Well, sometimes there are disagreements among uh, people I might call old timers. And so I try to get them together. And one might be thinking of where this old school was, say, in 1930, and another one might say, no, I'm thinking about 1950 because the building was moved at that time or the road was shifted. So there are some disagreements, if that might answer at least partially your question.
Mhm. So it sounds like you try to have a personal conversation with people who might disagree and see what common ground you can find between the two of them.
You need a lot of personal conversations.
Mhm.
I would say that probably 70 to 80% of the time it takes me to make a map is in the field. In other words, the research realm, and probably 20 to 30% is actually drawing the map.
So do you have a favorite? You've made many different county maps, many different historical periods. Was there one that stood out to you as fun, if you will, to research and create?
They all are interesting.
Mhm.
In Prince William County, for instance, I've drawn 3 historical maps. The first one, a large scale map of the entire county, took me quite maybe 10, 15 years to convince uh, people in Prince William to do such a map. Then I drew a African American history map of the county and also a map of the upper part of the county, north of Route 55, combining it with Lower Loudoun and East Fauquier counties. So those are my 3 Prince William County maps,
Mhm.
major ones at least.
Yeah, that's quite a few. Um, we sell that in our store, by the way. Your crossroads and corners map of Prince William, as well as the accompanying book. What I haven't seen personally is your American Indian map of Loudoun County. And I'd love to get my hands on that because I've always been curious how one makes a map depicting the Native Americans of a certain region. Where, for example, some of my curiosity stems from the fact that a lot of their settlements weren't permanent or they might be semi-permanent. So how do you move around that and make general how do you make maps of Native American cultures that might have been semi-permanent or
Well, I have been teaching American Indian history, area history, to Loudoun County public school teachers actually since 1973. It's not a course that is taught in the classroom, but it's taught in the field. We go out in a school bus. And in regard to the American Indians, we would stop at various sites that are still extant in the county, like a Indian cave that where there are marks or various what are called glyphs. Glyph is Glyph. It's a drawing by an Indian made thousands or many hundreds of years ago on rocks, indicating a picture. Or we will go to some other sites that were relevant to the American Indian community. So it's not something that I've just put together in a few months, but it's after many, many decades of research.
so I was wondering with the Native American maps, are you showing essentially what I've interpreted is that you're showing where certain historical sites or archaeological sites are in relation to the county, ones that you might be able to see, as well as ones that have existed historically, as opposed to hard borders that might have separated one tribe for another in certain time periods.
The American Indian map shows the locations of various settlements of the various tribes. It shows where I think the 7 tribes that inhabited Loudoun County at one time or another lived. And it shows some of the American Indian sites that are still extant in the county. And I also added the routes of the first 4 major explorers in the county, 3 of which uh, were trying to reach the American Indians to find out, so to speak, what they were up to. So the map is quite diverse, and it also has an explanation of Indian fish traps, of which there were many in the Potomac River, and there are some actually in Prince William County on some of the rivers. So it's a rather varied piece of art. It's
Mhm.
in full color, and it costs $20, and I'd certainly be glad to autograph it for any of your listeners and or yourself, of course. Um, I think it's the first attempt in the state for anybody to draw a map showing the heritage of the first peoples of the area.
Mhm. So who were those explorers you mentioned, the first three explorers that came to the area?
Well, perhaps the most famous were two gentlemen who started off from a plantation just south of Prince William County called Chapawamsek, right in the upper part of Stafford County. The graveyard is still there, right across the Chapawamsek River. It's now in the Marine Corps base at Quantico. Their names were Giles Vandercastle and Burr Harrison, and they went up the coast of the Potomac River, staying about a mile from the river, and reached a settlement of the Piscataway Nation
Mhm.
on what is now called either Conoy, Conyy Island, or Heater's Island after the Heater family in the Potomac River. It's sort of opposite Point of Rocks, Maryland. So that was one of the uh, exploratory uh, ventures. And another was the Rangers of David Strahan, Strahane, who went from what is then Prince William County into the Sugarland regions of Loudoun and down Broad Run, again to sort of assess the situation with American Indian nations.
Mhm. Well, that reminds me of one other author that we had lecture in the museum did a book about Fauquier County, and it included John Smith's maps of Virginia, or at least it discussed his maps of Virginia. So he never got as far north as Fauquier, but he did, through word of mouth, I suppose, with the Native Americans of the region, he was able to sort of do a rough sketch of some of our localities here. Have you seen those maps? How do they compare to reality? Were they fairly accurate?
Quite accurate. In 1937, I believe, there was a archaeologist, and the name is not immediately coming to me, but I think it shall, who took Smith's maps and started asking old timers along the Rappahannock River uh, about where they found large collections of arrowheads and spear points and other items, pottery. And from this, he ascertained where were the four major towns that Smith had mentioned and put on his map, which was pretty darn accurate for the time. Talks Netanya was one, Mahaskahad was another, uh, and Shakahania was another, and the fourth one name sort of escapes me. But we pretty well know now where these major settlements were
Mhm.
from the tremendous amount of artifacts that were. It's interesting to also notice that in regard to Fauquier County, that the major Piscataway settlement was exactly on a plantation called Glen Ora, where President and Mrs. Kennedy first had their home in the Virginia Piedmont in 1962, 63, sorry.
Mhm. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know the Kennedys were in this region. I'm new to this region. I was not actually born here, but uh, it's a fantastic job I have because I get to talk to people like you and learn quite a bit about our locality in a very short period of time. So is there a,
Well, thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you. I should be the one thanking you. You're educating me here. Um, is there a part of your career that you wish you could explore more? Is there something on the horizon that you want to tackle? Another subject area?
My current project is sort of scholarly. I'm doing it as sort of a thanks to the public libraries in Loudoun County,
Mhm.
who very nicely gave me some stipends for giving lectures about the American Indians, and decided that to prepare a bibliography of the critical bibliography of works on the American Indians in the area between the Potomac and Rapidan rivers and the Blue Ridge on the left, on the west, and the Fall Line on the east, and all of Loudoun, Fauquier, Rappahannock, Culpeper, and Madison counties.
Mhm.
So that's one of my projects that is almost finished, but not quite. And I will be distributing that work to libraries and other interested parties.
Great. Well, I can't wait to see that. Can I ask, is there any point in any part of your career, looking back, that you would like to examine more as well? Something more hypothetical, perhaps?
Well, there are a number of counties that I would have liked to have mapped, and I didn't because generally monetary reasons or people of what I was going to do. But otherwise, I've been pretty satisfied. I've mapped every county in the Northern Virginia Piedmont and several in the Shenandoah Valley and some in the Tidewater, and also several maps of the Bermuda Islands and some other maps of other states in New England and New York. So I'm done pretty well, I think.
I'd say so. So you're doing more work these days than just map making as well. You're a journalist for the Washington Post, is that correct?
I had to stop my writing with the Washington Post when I became planning commissioner of Loudoun County 8 years ago. And is a history of the Catoctin Farmers Club, which is the oldest agricultural organization in Virginia, and of which I am a member. And it goes back to right after the Civil War, still going strong. And I'm nearing completion of a very detailed history of that. All our minutes are extant, and it's really basically a history of agriculture from the mid 19th century onward.
I have a bit of a silly question, but I figure you're the man to ask. I got, as a gift for my recent birthday, this is a metal detector I've got here. So I haven't used it, but I figured you're the person to ask. Where should I take this thing in our locality? Where would you take a metal detector?
The first answer is take it where you're permitted to take it. And I have tried metal detecting, not with much success. All we seem to have gotten were nails and pieces of tin roofs. But other
Uh,
people have been are more proficient in it than I am. But when you go on private property, always make sure that you want to tell the person, ask their permission. And of course, you could look at my maps and see where such events as Civil War battles took place, where old houses once stood, sites like that, which tend to be places where there might be a higher degree of probability in pursuing your aims.
mhm. So how about if you could direct an archaeological team? Is there a certain site in Northern Virginia that you think deserves an archaeological look?
The ones that deserve most archaeological looks are ones that are in the most danger of being subsumed by development. There are a lot of very, very interesting sites that absolutely there's no danger of their ever being destroyed unless by vandals. So one must, I guess, look at older maps and documents like the 1937 aerial photography, which was the first aerials that were ever flown of this area. And if you look at them, they were, the resolution is marvelous. They were flown with Swedish Hasselblad cameras that were rented from Nazi Germany. It was 1937. And they're very, very interesting. I noticed that Prince William County has blow-ups of all of them, meaning the originals were 9-inch square, and the blow-ups, I believe, are either 24 inches or 30 inches. So they contain a great deal of information as to what stood at the beginnings of the automobile age.
Hmm. Great. Well, I have one question from a docent of ours. She was a person who introduced me to your maps beyond just the one that I have in my own home. She brought me your Prince William map and showed it to me. She wants to know when you started working in Waterford and if you could tell us a bit about the history of her buildings.
Well, I moved to Waterford in 1965, and the village is a National Historic Landmark. It has a population of about 200, 220 people. It's basically sort of a 19th century village of homes, most of them restored. Nothing spectacular, but it presents the appearance of what a village might have looked like 100 or more years ago. And my office is in the middle of town. I have it open to the public every Waterford Fair, which is the first weekend, full weekend in October, first full Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in October. And there I peddle my wares, so to speak. in other words, my books and my
Mhm.
historical maps, which go in price anywhere from, I'd say, $10 to a couple of $35. That was about the most expensive. And of course, I autograph every one. And most of the maps are originals because of the way they are made. And again, I mentioned they're made in a process that is no longer used by any map maker of uh, known note in the country or world.
Well, I'm going to have to stop by there at some point and pick up a
Please
lot of your
do.
books and maps. Well, I have one question for you here. What would you say is the oldest historical site in our general region of Northern Virginia?
They certainly would be in the area we're talking about in Stafford County. Probably, I would say some graveyards. I mentioned the graveyard at Chapawamsick, the old Harrison graveyard. But some of those graveyards go back to the mid 17th century. And so I would certainly say those graveyards are the oldest sites
Mhm.
that we have in this area.
Well, I'll also have to check those out as well, won't I? All right. Well, I thank you for your time today. I know we're just scratching the surface here, really. If I could have a conversation with you for a few hours, I would. So maybe in the future we'll have to do this again.
Sounds good. Very pleasing to meet you. And I'm glad that you're doing something like this. It's always good to get out and try to see what different people are doing in different professions and ways of life. Thank you again.
That's right. Thank you as well. All right. I'll sign off here and thank you for your time again. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right.